Hey guys, it's Micah Young, the host of another Philosophical Tuesday. Thank you for joining us as we probe another corner of reality. In today's podcast, we explore the nature and role of government. Specifically, we discuss concepts such as the different types of government, the extremes of democracy and tyranny, and natural rights. Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoy this episode. Welcome to another Philosophical Tuesday, where it takes us 5 takes to be able to put something on the internet that we won't be canceled for. I'm here with Josh Smith, who is currently wearing glasses and headphones at the same time. How are you doing, Josh?
I'm great, Micah. I also am wearing a head. Yeah, I'm wearing a head.
Okay.
And I'm...
This is never going to get done.
But we can keep this one. Go ahead,
Yeah,
Charles.
keep going.
What do you have to say?
And I am here
Wait, he has to
with
finish.
Josh, who is the OG Josh. Although I am the real G Josh, so... We don't need to get into semantics here.
I'm also wearing glasses and headphones.
But not a head.
Let it be known.
Yes, I was not trying to
ahead.
distinguish the
I left
two of you. You are not wearing a head.
I will say that I would have kept the original take, except that my co-hosts are cowards. So, and Micah can't take a
Speak for
compliment.
yourself.
I'm here with Micah, who is also wearing glasses and headphones, but also not a head. So, there's that.
Yes, but I am also wearing knees, and therefore that distinguishes me from you. You are not wearing knees.
No, I'm not.
You are wearing Cheetos.
I am wearing Cheetos. I'm actually covered in Cheetos right now.
So today we're going to be talking about the role and purpose of government, which is totally fitting given the way
I feel like there's a way in which this topic is connected to the fact that Josh is covered in Cheetos right now.
Do tell
Yes,
us, Josh.
So basically, well, if you think about it, Josh is literally covered in Cheetos, and in a certain sense, his entire essence has been integrated with the mass of the Cheetos. And if you think about it, it's kind of parallel to the way in which the individuals kind of mesh into a collective inside one cohesive body that is governed by a group of these people who rule them.
Josh,
the
you
government.
just described the opposite of Josh being covered in Cheetos.
Yeah, I don't quite understand that.
You
but,
just said a group of people gets covered in one cohesive body.
No.
Josh is one cohesive body covered in a group of Cheetos. That is the
He has
opposite
become
thing.
one with the many.
No, the many have joined his one.
Yes, and that's
Not the one
exactly what
joined
happens.
together.
The many, as in the people, join together.
No,
In one
his
body.
is from many one. We're talking about his is from one many. Wait, what?
What?
Okay,
No.
I feel like
This
this...
analogy's gone too far. We're moving on.
Okay, let's bring this down to a serious note. So fundamentally, why? Let's not ask the question, why does the government exist, as in what, because there's a lot of different ways you could go with that. You could say, why historically does the government exist? That kind of thing. But what is the purpose of the government?
Well, I guess we do kind of have to ask, not why does government exist exactly, but is government necessary? That could be a more fundamental question. Because to be able to answer what role the government should have, we have to first understand what a government is.
So are we being prescriptive about this, or are we being descriptive about
Well,
it?
you have to be prescriptive about it, because in order to define the term government, you are prescribing some sort of action that goes along with what the government is. So you can't just describe a government without it correlating to any action, because an inactive government might as well not be any government.
So why do we need government?
Well,
Do we need government?
Do we need government?
I mean, we could operate off that premise and just kind of explain why we need it.
Why might we need government? What might be some
Okay.
reasons why we might need
well, one reason I can think of is the corruptive and corrosive effects of power and people who take advantage of other people through those means. So you have individuals who are concerned about living peaceful lives, and they are generally moral people who have no ill will towards others, and there are other people who are extremely aggressive and extremely impulsive who might take advantage of those people.
So to protect good people from bad people would be one reason?
That's one good reason, I think. And I think that brings up another point, which is, what is the best way to protect good people from bad people? And you could make the argument that the best way to protect good people is to equip those good people with the defense mechanisms necessary for preventing the bad people from being able to overpower them, whether that's some sort of weaponry or tactical skills or just being
but is that really even possible?
Well, I think...
I mean, how well would I have to train you and arm you so that no bad person, just using that term vaguely, could come in and hurt you?
Sure, and that's a good point, but I think what I'm trying to get at is less of a collectively imposed measure that would equip all of these good people. But what I'm presenting is more of an argument for just individualism, in which people can decide for themselves whether or not they want to survive. So it doesn't have to be a collectively imposed measure. It could be just individuals deciding they want to survive, and so they equip themselves with weaponry and tactics to be able to.
But I mean, it could be, and that would be anarchy. But then we could theorize that is the best. The best form of government is no government. I guess the question is what might be some advantages to having a government as opposed to just being an anarchy.
I mean, one advantage is sort of to kind of go up against what you said there, Josh. Rather than forcing all citizens to be equipped to properly defend themselves against any evil, just as people specialize in terms of a trade, government is a form for people to specialize in the trade of protection. It's an opportunity for people to specialize in protection, i.e. the form of a military or a police force, as opposed to every person being required to be fully trained in self-defense.
And in that sense, against it's more orderly. So we could argue that the rule of government prevents chaos to an extent. And I think we all agree that anarchy is pretty chaotic.
Another thing that government does that sort of prevents chaos from coming about is it provides a context for having laws that a group of people agree upon, and it prevents individuals from being responsible for dealing out justice, which can be somewhat problematic because there's no separation between dealing out justice and seeking revenge.
Well, and how about collective identity and purpose? Do you think government might serve a role in creating some sort of collective purpose for individuals?
Well, that's an interesting question. And do we think that do we need, if there's such a thing as collective purpose, if that's something that's desirable, is government a necessary force in creating that, or do we not have alternative institutions that could fill that void?
Do we even need it to be an institution to have a collective purpose?
Well, yeah, that too.
I don't think you necessarily need to have an institution. It could be a cause so compelling that people just rally around it because it's such a force that they believe in, that they want to follow.
So government can provide that, but government doesn't.
It doesn't need to be the source of it.
It doesn't need to be the source of it. It might not even necessarily be the best or even a good source of it.
Well, and you look at the ways that individuals have found meaning in their lives throughout history, and two major ways that you consistently see throughout all of history are family and a church or some sort of religion. And nowadays, in much more secularized societies, you see a lot less emphasis on family, a lot less emphasis on religion, and a lot more emphasis on, well, some sort of alternative to that.
What's interesting is in that same time period, the government has grown exponentially. So it almost seems like people are replacing those institutions that at one point provided that kind of collecting meaning with government itself.
Yeah, I think that's definitely the case, to some extent at least. And there have been lots of different ways throughout history that the purpose of government has been perceived. For instance, with the early Greeks, such as Plato in his Republic, for instance, his main argument is that the purpose of the government is to educate its citizens so that they can be well educated and lead the population. So basically the entire purpose of government is to educate its citizens and teach politicians how to be philosophers, which is very different from, really, it's not fundamentally different, I don't think, but it's very different in form than a lot of our Western societies nowadays.
I mean, it seems that in the world today, it seems to be the job of the government, at least in the minds of a lot of people on both sides of the aisle, to fix everybody's problems. Which would certainly indicate that, you talk about problem-solving institutions, you talk about families, and you talk about the church, historically, or religion. That's another bit of evidence that the government has replaced those institutions, because when we'll call them institutions, because not as in their entities, but as in their ideas, the fact that the government has begun to replace those in that area, that's another piece of evidence for that.
Well, and I guess we might ask what sort of things we think the government should be responsible for managing, because you pointed out that people often tend to rely on the government to fix their problems, and that's a good point. People do that, but we need to get into specifics a little bit, because obviously there's if we agree on the necessary existence of government, then we will have to agree that there are some problems that the government should fix, rightfully. But perhaps there are many problems that the government also deems worth fixing that it probably should not try to fix.
I would ask the question, what problems could or does the government attempt to, or maybe even does, solve or fix or attempt to fix that could not be done by an entity that is not the government?
And that's going to be a hard case to make, because you could basically you could get a group of people together and do basically anything that the government could do. The only advantage you get with the government is that, for one, you have the advantage of laws and the penalty of being penalized, going to jail, being fined if you disobey those laws. So what
is the advantage of laws?
So what I'm trying to say with the advantage of laws is you can coerce action through those laws.
What kind of action?
Well, it could be prescriptive action, or it could be don't do this thing.
Actions or prohibitions that are desired by the collective for the good ordering of the collective and of the society.
Yeah.
And you could argue that another institution could fulfill that, but the problem is the only other institution that's going to fulfill that is going to be, by definition, a government. If an institution is imposing laws on people that require them to act a certain way or face consequences, it's essentially acting like a government. We could just talk about different levels of sovereignty or scope,
So if we say that say the keeping of justice is a necessary and desirable thing that only a government can properly do. What outside
I
of
don't
that,
think we said that.
trying to expand. Well, but if that, I mean, isn't that what we are saying?
So the keeping of justice. I think it was
keeping
more
of law and order, something that primarily has to be done.
Okay.
By
Yes.
a government. So if that's one thing that I think we could all agree on as being a necessity. What are there more things that we could add to that we think are things that must be upheld by a government that couldn't be upheld by another institution?
So I guess we need to define law and order, because it's a pretty blanket term there.
Well, we said protecting the weak from the strong, or was it the good from the bad?
I would prefer good from bad than from weak. I would prefer good from bad as opposed to weak from strong.
Right, because the government
there are
becomes
plenty
strong
of,
then.
Well, yeah, but there are human beings are naturally going to be weak and strong, and that's going to result in natural differences. If you're assuming that it's the government's job to correct those differences, then you're assuming that there's no, at that point it's just leveling the playing field.
And that is
right?
that's an actual argument that's pretty mainstream nowadays, and we actually could play with that a bit. But whether the government should protect the weak from the strong, is there something wrong with being strong, and is the government the right institution to be able to provide resources to weak people to uplift them to a better quality of life?
Well, being weak or being strong is not a moral point of status.
Correct.
Being a weak person or being a strong person is a description of your sort of your skill.
It depends on how you're defining those
Depends on how you
terms.
define it.
Because
if you there's a lot of different ways to define
it could be a distinction of moral value.
Yeah.
If you're weak and you're prone to giving in to your base temptations because you're weak, then that could be a moral failing, as opposed to being strong against falling for your maybe
That's
baser
fair.
And actually,
desires.
I think
So it
that
can
is
be.
the fundamental source of weakness, perhaps, is, I don't want to say moral failing, but inadequacy. The lack of ability to further oneself or creates their potential self into a more capable and strong and worthwhile individual in this world.
I would argue that it's far more desirable to be strong than it is to be weak.
Of course
I
it
think a
is.
strong person is generally perceived as being a much more moral person than being a weak person. If you see somebody who's weak, you think, okay, that's the alcoholic, that's the drug addict.
I'm thinking less in terms of moral, of applying. You could apply this a descriptor moral or weakness of will to those things. I'm thinking more just in terms of
Physical
ability.
strength and ability.
Physical strength. We might even say skill.
Well, is skill not
But
something
we ought to
learned?
we ought to specify then that we are talking about
but-
that, not because that's not the same thing as strength and weakness. That is a matter of skill or intelligence, and that's a different thing.
Yeah.
Well, but that is a form of strength or weakness. It's you're just thinking of it in sort of moral terms. You're right. We need to define our terms.
Yeah, we just need to. It doesn't matter what we call it, but we need to clarify what we're talking about.
Let's pull this back a little bit. Josh, you mentioned, regardless of whether we're making this we're calling strength or weakness a moral thing or not. If we view it as the government's job to promote law and order, i.e. and again, we got to define that, but that doesn't necessarily mean ensuring that people in society are moral. In fact, law and order does not imply ensuring morality. It implies punishing a lack of morality.
It prescribes benefits for partaking in moral actions, or at least actions that
Does
are
it
deemed
prescribe benefits for that, or does it just? I tend to agree more with Micah's definition that it's purely a method of punishment.
I'm playing devil's advocate a bit, but well, at the very least, it's giving benefits to those that undertake actions which the government has deemed moral. And of course, there's
No, it doesn't.
It doesn't do that. Not in any government that I can think of.
It doesn't. It may indirectly promote things like free trade, or we might say, people. It might promote people doing things that are morally good, because if it's a dichotomy, if the choice is to do something morally good or morally bad, and people will get punished for doing the morally bad, then yes, you could say that the government imposing a law promotes the moral good. But it doesn't necessarily. It doesn't just. It's not an incentive, it's a decentive.
And the power of government primarily comes from the threat of force. It primarily comes from decentive. And you might even say that, okay, well, maybe if the government does offer rewards, where does it get the rewards from? The government
here is my counter
somebody
argument.
Else to the...
My counter argument is going back to the strength versus weakness argument. So if the government wants to create individuals who are becoming collectively stronger, then is not law and order the way to go about that? Teaching individuals to carry themselves with the responsibility to be able to follow the dictates given to them by a strong government, and being able to perform their tasks in society diligently and giving of themselves to the collective, does that not increase the strength of the collective and therefore the strength of the individual?
Well, I think we've jumped the gun a little bit, because I don't think we've established that it's the role of the government, that it's a necessary role of government to level out the whole strength versus weakness.
And that's exactly why I'm raising this, so that we can establish that, whether it is.
I would also argue that the government doesn't necessarily call people to moral heights by instituting laws and orders. The government does not call people to responsibility. The government does not call people to better themselves. The government calls people not to break the law. Now,
that's a fundamental assumption, though.
But here's the thing: if you don't break the law, if you choose to avoid breaking the law, you have two options. You can either work and better yourself, or you can starve or become a beggar or die.
Okay, but does the government...
Those are the options. The option is not...
We're having two separate conversations right now, because Mike is talking in the descriptive and Josh is talking in the prescriptive.
Sure.
And so there's no way for us to get... We're going to have to establish, before I think we move forward, whether or not we are describing our ideal government, what we think a government should be, or whether or not we're describing what the government actually is and what the role that it actually fills is in kind of real life scenarios.
I think the second is what I'm
Mike
going
is talking about.
I'm going for the second. I'm trying to get to the essence of what government is, and that's why I'm raising these questions. It's not because I'm trying to prescribe a way of doing things. It's because I'm trying to help us understand whether it is the government's place to promote.
But you just said place.
You said place. That's prescriptive.
That's prescriptive.
That's not descriptive.
Sure.
Descriptive is the government actively doing this. Prescriptive is should the government be doing this. So we have to.
Oh, if we're using the terms that way, then I guess I'm getting into prescriptive more.
Yeah, that's how at least I've been using. That's how I've been. Maybe I'm wrong in that, but that's at least how I've been.
No, you're right.
Those.
I was just looking at the terms a bit differently, but you're right. So what I'm trying to get at is whether the government desires to create a moral collective by imposing the laws that it does. Because, Micah, you mentioned that the government that doesn't really care about... Well, I don't want to...
Which government are we talking about? You say the government desires this. If you say the government desires, you have to have a government in mind when you say
Let me ask you a question. Josh. There are two ways to form a government. There's two ways to go about this that I can think of. And these are going to be big categories, but there's two fundamental ways I can think about forming a government. Somebody who has a really, really big stick goes around and says, I have the biggest stick. If you don't listen to me, I'm going to hit you with the stick. And you're not going to like that, and life's going to be pretty nasty for you. So everybody decides to listen to the guy with the big stick.
Which one of us has the biggest stick?
The other option... The other option...
You are now muted, Josh.
Thanks.
Anyway, the first option is for the government to go around... I'm saying it this way so you can cut that out. and or is for somebody who has the biggest stick to come around and say, you have to do what I say, or I'm going to hit you with this stick. Okay? The alternative is a bunch of people get together and say, we really don't like the idea of one person having the biggest stick and coming around to beat us all up with it. So we're going to pull our resources, we're going to come together, and we're going to say, let's get together, and let's pool our resources to collectively wield a form of sovereignty and power that will allow us to set up society and force society to operate in a way that we want to operate, rather than it operating on the basis of who has the biggest club.
Sure. So it's, in a certain sense, tyranny versus democracy.
I mean, that's what I'm posing. So there's those two options. In the case of tyranny, what does the government actually care about? Does the government care about creating a moral society? I mean, maybe the government thinks they want a moral society, but they're defining morals on the basis of what they want people to do.
Yes.
In the case of what we might call not necessarily a democracy, but a government by the people, at the very least, a government,
a republic
on the
sovereignty.
The people is the seat of sovereignty.
Desire that? Couldn't there be a tyrant who even by enforcing his ideals through force, has good ideals?
And that's the exact question I asked a few minutes ago, and you guys said I was way off point.
But we were just having two separate conversations. So
yeah. So now we're to that again. So I was asking whether it can be the place of government to actually care about morality and try to enforce that in its people.
I mean, the obvious to that is obviously yes, it can be. Again, there's always.
Well, what is the ideal?
The government can be whatever the government.
Sure. What is the ideal?
We want it to be, but that's the question.
Yeah.
Is it the government's? Do we think that? And this is really more of a moral question. Do we think that the government has the right to dictate to its citizens, be it tyranny or democracy, that it has the right, that it's desirable for the government to dictate to them what is moral or not, to enforce a moral society?
I would argue that if the government isn't enforcing a moral society, it's even if we don't agree on what a moral society is, if the government is not enforcing some sort of law or order or requirement of the people who it is sovereign over, it is effectively not a government. It's not. There's no point in calling it a government. There's no point in whatever it might be. It doesn't. If it's not wielding any power, even if it has power, if it's not using that power, you might argue that anyone. Again, it's so weird to think about how you would actually define a government, because sometimes a government really just is whoever has the biggest army and whoever is able to kick everyone else into line, because they're going to be killed if they don't obey. And in that case, the government has the right.
Usually that's more of a primitive or underdeveloped government.
Well, yes, we would.
Not always. I don't know. Not always. Usually,
it's
even a very advanced civilization. Ultimately, there's a threat of force behind the government action.
There has to be a threat of force behind government action. Otherwise, it's meaningless government action.
It may not be the sole force, and that's an important distinction.
Yes.
It may not be the sole force the government uses, but it is still present.
Well, think about it this way. Jaywalking is, I think, in most places illegal. You're supposed to use the crosswalk. When was the last time you heard of somebody getting in trouble because they were jaywalking? And that's the thing, is it's a law, it's something the government says, but it's not enforced.
Right.
Speeding.
And that
you go like 2 over the speed limit, aren't you breaking a law? And yet everybody goes like 10 over. At least around here.
Right.
If someone goes 2 over the limit and someone else is going 20 over the limit, the guy that got pulled over for going 20 over can say justifiably, well, that guy was speeding too. Like, where's the justice in this? And I guess that gets into, to some extent, the morality behind these decisions. It may be morality, it might not be morality, but I want to hear you guys' thoughts on this. So if the government...
Before we talk about the morality of the specific decisions and how they come about those specific decisions as to what is moral and what isn't, because I think that is where we need to go next. Can we agree that we think that it is the role of the government, that it is maybe the fundamental role of government even, to enforce morality?
It is the role of the government to punish evil. fundamentally.
What's the difference?
But we've already established, I think, through our previous conversations, that a government could legitimately wield its power to enforce a moral society. That could be legitimate use of government.
So it could not only punish evil, but it could reward good.
Why not?
And enforce a moral society.
And
yeah, no, I don't disagree with you.
The question then becomes who's choosing the values, and maybe that's the more important question here.
Right, and again, that's the thing we have to be careful about is when I keep referring to a moral society, I'm not talking about an objective set of morals that we could argue about what those are. I'm talking about whoever's in the seat of government, what is their perspective on what morality is and what a moral society should look like, and what are they doing to try and enforce that, or to try and at the very least prohibit people from doing things that are, again, and maybe that would be part of your moral code itself. Is you could argue that it could be a part of a moral system as to whether or not good is rewarded and evil is punished, or simply evil is punished. It could even be part of a moral system that you choose not to punish evil and only to reward good. Now, we would call that more of a charity than we would a government, which is interesting. Because power implies the ability to punish and the threat of punishment, not necessarily just the threat of reward.
Yeah,
but it could legitimately include the promise of reward, right?
Oh, of course, it could include that. Absolutely.
And often, of course, governments will frame the not punishing you for not doing something bad as a reward enough.
At the very least, the punishment of bad is the establishment of a minimum standard for good, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, and I think a lot of the morality you will see in this kind of society is a sense of communal ethics, values that this particular society or city has determined are important to them and worth fighting for. And so you're going to see different senses of morality guiding each individual government if you have a world filled with these governments that are aimed at protecting and defending the moral good. But you're going to see probably more stable societies than you would if they did not have morality at the front and center.
What else would a government have at the front of center other than keeping of a particular set of laws that are ingrained as effectively as a moral code? Because you can't really separate a government. You could separate a government trying to enforce a law to accomplish a purpose that's not ingrained in some sort of higher ideal. You could separate that out a little bit, but fundamentally, if a government's making a law, it's promoting a certain kind of behavior.
Yeah.
And we might call that a moral decision. So it's promoting one behavior over another. So anytime a government does something that requires the response and action of its citizens, it is effectively, it's making a law, it's making a moral judgment.
It's what is making the moral judgment? The government?
Well, the government's it's making a moral statement,
right?
And it's asking for a response.
Yes,
to that
I agree.
In order for a government to make a law, it's making a moral judgment.
Yes, I agree.
That goes without saying.
I guess I'm saying they're all one and the same.
The question would be from where, who has the right to make a moral judgment. So if it's something that, from where does the government derive? Is it just the government says so, therefore it is?
Yeah, that's basically an argument for morality from power.
I said practically it derives from the threat of punishment for non-compliance, or even the threat of reward for compliance.
Where is the decision made? Where ought the decision be made for that?
Well, there's where ought it be made, and there's where is it made practically.
Well, and where it is made practically may vary wildly depending on the government. So maybe
right.
so that may be a better question to ask: where ought it be made?
Well, and there's where is it actually made, as in who says this is how it will be. There is who decides that they're going to follow what has been prescribed. So there's the government making a law. There's people deciding that the law is worth fulfilling in order that they do not fall under the punishment of the government, or that the government would sufficiently reward them. And then there is what decision should have been made and by who. So there's kind of...
That may be more what I'm getting at, is the third one.
Okay.
In other words, a government comes up with a law, or a government thinks that should come up with, or maybe not even the government thinks or does. If there is a value, any value that we're talking about, who has the right to decide whether or not that is a value that is enforced by the government?
Well, what is a right? Are we talking moral rights?
Talking natural rights?
Yeah, you might say moral rights. And again, this is a conversation of should, not a conversation of is. So who has the moral right to dictate that we as a society are going to hold this as a value and enshrine it in our law such that you are punished or rewarded for following or not following this particular value? Well, who has the right to say that?
And that's a fundamental question about the structure of particular governments, because
it is. But that's what I'm getting.
The people, if it's the majority, then that's basically a democracy. If it's the person who has the biggest army, then that's a tyranny. And so we're back to the same question.
That is the question, and that's what I'm getting at. Who has that right? And here's another question too. Might there be some values that supersede either of them? In other words, there are some values that if the collective rejects them and a tyrant accepts them, it might be right, or vice versa. If the tyrant rejects them and the collective accepts them, the collective accepts them, that may be right as well. Do the values themselves supersede the decisions of whatever force by which we're making the decision as to what government ought to enforce or not?
They have to.
Well, and it would depend on what values we are talking about. For instance, certain communal, like I mentioned, communal ethics, and there are certain values that are derived from a certain way of living, and I think those type of values might not supersede whatever force is enacting them. But there are definitely...
Let's take one that's not controversial. Let's say thou shalt not kill. Does that value itself supersede any particular decision-making process that might undergird a particular government deciding to enforce it or not enforce it?
Yes.
Unless the only way that does not supersede that is if you hold it as a higher value. If you hold the will of a particular group of people, we'll say the collective, if you hold that as the highest value, if you hold that as an absolute value, that is always what is right, is the will of the people and what the people want, the morals of the people. If you hold that as your highest value, then you don't need thou shalt not kill to be inherently moral in and of itself for it to be the quote-unquote right moral position. If the right moral position is determined by what the most people think is the right moral position, then it's whatever the most people think is the right moral position.
So what you're arguing is that the morality of the choice comes from the force enacting said decision.
No. I'm saying that there is a particular value system that places the highest value on okay.
I wasn't trying to say you believed that. I was trying to say
no.
You're putting forward an argument for it.
So what we're arguing about here is, we're kind of arguing, is there natural morality? Is there natural rights? Is there an objective set of right moral ways things should be, ways of doing things that exist separate to any form of government, any form of any system that are outside of those?
Yes.
Okay?
Yeah.
So, you either have that, or you don't, or you have one highest moral, and that highest moral says that whatever the will of the people is, or whatever the will of the sovereign is, there's two different ways of approaching that.
So that sounds kind of contradictory, because it's almost as if the only natural moral thing is that there are no natural moral things. That's the height. Is that what you're saying?
No. That's not what I'm saying.
Okay.
Or that morality is dictated. Well, but then the question, I think, isn't necessarily, is there such a thing as a morality that supersedes? The question is, where does the morality that supersedes come? Because then the question, it's a disagreement. It's basically a question of who your God is. You know, is it your? I don't know if it's separate.
And interestingly enough, in the sort of the divine right of kings argument, the God, your God is almost the king, which is sort of ironic because the king's authority is supposed to come from the God. But in a monarchy who claims his sovereignty is derived from God, he is effectively the end all be all to morality. What he says goes as far as moral judgments are concerned. In a democracy, we'll say a constitutional form of government, where the people make the government and the people assent or consent to the rule of the government, the people are the ones who are the ultimate authority. The people are the ones who determine morality, because the people ultimately have the final say in that. So you have the options in it being in one person. You have the option of the moral seat being in one person, the moral authority being in one person. You have the options of the moral authority being in the collective. You have the option of the moral authority being in a set of people, or you have the option of moral authority being external to humans themselves. That is the argument for natural rights and objective morality.
Right.
And typically, you have to place that seat of moral authority in God or something like God. Because otherwise, you can't have morals that aren't just determined by one person or a set of people.
Right. Well, and for some arguments have been more nuanced as well, such as, well, the ancient Greek, was it a play, Antigone? That was actually a pretty good story as to the nature of what is right and what is wrong in the eyes of people and in the eyes of the gods, because the basic central tenet of the plot is the king, who has been placed in his position of power by the gods, says that, I think it was his brother who betrayed him, was not to be given a proper burial, according to Greek tradition. And Antigone, who's his niece, gets really mad about that and gives him a proper burial anyways, because that is the tradition of the Greeks, of their family, of their lineage, of their society. And the king, who has been placed there by the gods, says not to do that, but she does it anyways, and it kind of paints her as the heroine of the story for having done so. And so in that you see a sort of view of morality as not necessarily coming from a king or from the gods, or maybe from the gods. Maybe it is, but it's a more nuanced view for sure.
Well, I mean, in that story, there's not the idea is not that just because the king does something, it must be a moral thing.
Yes.
I mean, he's given the authority to do what he wishes.
Right.
But that does not mean that just because he does something, it is a moral
exactly
thing. And in that case, there has to be a morality that is outside of the seat of the king himself.
Right. And just because any government imposes moral restrictions on its people does not necessarily mean the government is creating morality or imposing a morality that they have subjugated to themselves on the people. It's probably the best way to understand it is the government grasping some sort of natural morality that comes from God or nature or what have you, and trying to make the best sense that it can of it by creating certain laws.
But that's one way of looking at the government's actions. The other way of looking at the government's actions is everything that the government does.
But that's assuming that the actions of the government are guided by good rather by benevolence rather than good.
So I think we've properly defined what the options are. I guess the question is what do we think the right one is? At some point we're gonna have to make some assumptions just to be able to continue the conversation. Because we could spend hours and hours differentiating what all the different options are, right?
Right.
And maybe that's all we want to do. Maybe that's the entire purpose of the podcast is to theorize about all the potential options. But maybe that's actually a good question. What are we trying to determine through the course of this conversation?
We'll see.
We'll see. Well, so let's maybe for the sake of not having the conversation run for forever, and we could always elaborate on this later. Let's try to come to a consensus about, and this is going to be an assumption, we're not going to try to spend too much time justifying this, but where would we say that morality ought to be derived? Let's assume that as a basis, and then let's move the conversation on from that assumption, assuming with that as the basis. Of the ones that we've listed, where would we say that the morality ought be derived? Or the virtue, or whatever you want to call it, ought be derived from.
So we're talking
God,
about.
We're talking from the collective. We're talking from the tyrant. We're talking
we're talking about the government takes actions and tries to base their actions on something.
Yes.
What are they basing that on?
What would we, if we were to pick one that we feel is, and again, we could spend hours just debating this one thing. Maybe it's all we want to do today. But do we want to move? If all we want to do is debate that, that's fine. But do we want to move the conversation beyond that point? And if we do, we need to pick one of those things that we can say, we're using this as our basis for continuing the conversation. We're assuming that morality from government stems from this particular position, be it God, be it the collective, be it the tyrant, whatever. And then move the conversation on from there. If we want to move the conversation beyond that point, we have to pick one. Otherwise, we're never going to get any farther. At least not tonight.
Well, let's spend a little more time on it, at least for now, and then try to come to a consensus.
Okay, that's fair. So what do we think? What do we think some of the virtues are? If we're trying to come to a consensus, what do we think the virtues are of one over the other? Why ought you? Well, let's start with the collective. Why would we want to derive morality from the collective? What would be the benefit of that?
The benefit is probably...
And the drawback.
Well, the benefit is probably that people are generally happier because they feel more well-represented. But, well, I mean, a drawback on the same note would be there's going to be usually a significant minority of people who feel left out of the political system.
And people might not even necessarily... The things that make people happy in the immediate may not be what's good for them either.
Right.
So that's another important thing to consider.
Yes,
is what the majority of people want.
Is the governing principle for society immediate gratification, or is it a long-term stable society? Which one will be more fulfilling for?
It seems from at least a historical perspective that the answer to that would be that societies generally choose when they're given the option. They generally choose immediate gratification,
and they generally fall.
So that's worth noting. That's
well,
a pretty significant drawback.
You also note a lot of societies in which the ideal was a long-term stable system where corruption seeped in, what else have you, and eventually the society went off the rails. And
because stability breeds complacency. And when you're being complacent, you no longer care about building a long-term stable system. You just care about making your own life even better than it already is.
Well, and once you make your own life better, and usually better has some sort of correlation to material gain, then you often become wrapped up in that material gain. So greed, lust, vice start to sneak in, treachery, because there's lots of people, there's power dynamics, and the bigger and bigger the government gets, the more and more variables you have at play. And so it would only make natural sense for those sort of vices to sneak in
Yeah.
once you have that complacency in effect.
So it seems like the real danger of deriving morality from a place like the collective is that the society tends to stagnate, tends to become wrapped up in self-indulgence, and it stagnates. It's incapable of action. It's incapable of real, maybe you might even say, goodness, and it collapses as a result of its own inability. They become so wrapped up in their own self-gratification that they fail to see the barbarians at the gate, so to speak. You know?
My.
So
This is spelling doom for the United States.
It might. So how about tyranny? How about from the king? What would be the benefits and drawbacks of deriving morality from the king?
Do we come up with any benefits for deriving morality from the
A
collective?
very centralized decision-making
just
system.
It makes people feel good. I think that's what makes that's the benefit of the collective. But for the king, what would be the benefits or drawbacks?
The benefit, I see the primary benefit as there being a centralized decision-making system.
Yeah. So stagnation isn't really an issue with that, as opposed to you might see with the idea of the collective. Well, it could be.
It would be. Not, it would be, but it's not because people get complacent. It's because
the king gets complacent.
And who is king changes, and that so fundamentally as much stability as
that actually creates
brings,
a lot of instability.
It creates there is more stability over a period of time. But there are more rapid changes that occur than do in a
So during the small period of time that a given ruler is in charge, you might see more stability. But the rapid, if there is a rapid succession of changes in leadership, then you will see probably a lot of significant changes being made.
You'll see more stability and you'll see more getting done. This is the contrast we have with, for example, the United States. The United States is really, really good. Not necessarily about government stability or about the government getting something done, but about the government not changing rapidly. And that is the advantage of a very democratic system, especially a very, very divided two-party system.
Now,
right?
I would wonder if that's actually true. And I think that you could look at the United States over the last century, say, and see the extent to which it's moved. Have we moved less than we would have if we had two different tyrants in the course of our lifetime? I don't know that we would have. And so I do wonder if the issue of stability and rapid change isn't actually overblown when we look at the historical record of these things.
That may be true. We certainly tend to view things more in terms of generations than in centuries, I think. But even generationally, things do change a lot. Maybe we view them more in terms of election cycles than we do in terms of generations.
It's become so, of course, we become so reliant on the federal government that it really does start to feel like we're just electing a different tyrant every 4 years. And then it really does not feel, because we're not even talking about for life now. We're talking about every 4 years, the direction of the country completely changes. So I kind of reject the idea that the idea of the democracy provides inherently more stability.
Well, and I think we might be making a dangerous assumption by labeling the United States democracy as well.
That's fair too.
I think the United States is kind of its own case. But I think another important point to your point, though, Josh, is that there are a lot of variables at play other than government itself that influence political decisions, such as technological progress or social movements. So,
and those can't be understated, and that could be true in either of those societies. Now you might say that just by nature of there only being one decision maker, and if we're going to talk about kind of consistency, like what would you say? Unity in action, is that what we want to call it? Obviously, having one person making all the decisions is going to allow for a much more rapid decision-making process than having a billion people making decisions.
Perhaps, right? Assuming the tyrant is motivated to make decisions.
Assuming the tyrant is motivated. But at least theoretically, you could say And I think
There's
this,
less
I think
red
this is the
tape.
primary difference. If you were, and I think this is true when it comes to stability. I think it's true when it comes to rapid addressing of problems that pop up, and I think it's true in far of general morality. I think it could be said that a good king is a far more effective force of government than a democracy is, and yet a bad king is a far worse form of government than a democracy could be. And so you could, I think that could be a fair assumption that it's
No,
not.
of course.
It's not.
Yeah, that I agree
Yeah.
with that, because it only makes logical sense given it's a centralized decision-making machine. So if there's a good king who wants to make good decisions for his people, then ideally, then a lot of the citizens will be happy. And if he doesn't have the citizens' best interest at heart, then he will get whatever he wants, and then you get a tyrant.
Whereas a democracy may stagnate in the middle, and nobody really ends up all that happy. I think we're kind of rapidly approaching that point in our own society. Now, so we've talked about democracy, we've talked about tyranny. What about deriving it from a higher? We derive now our value system from a higher force than man. What are the benefits and drawbacks of that?
Well, and of course, we don't want to negate the argument for materialism as well.
We could talk about materialism too, but
before we go there, I have a question. If we're not deriving our morality from a higher society, Josh, what do you mean by a good king and a bad king?
Well, that's an excellent question.
Because you just use the term good king and a bad king to quantify what a king is, whether a tyrant would be desirable or not.
Now, you could say the same thing about the same thing about a democracy, right?
Sure, and we were kind of talking that way about the democracy.
So you're assuming you have to assume, but again, and this is a legitimate point here, and I'm not, to be clear, in order to assume good or bad or right or wrong, we have to assume such a thing as an objective morality. And so I guess the ultimate point here, what I'm trying to get at when we're kind of navigating around these things, is that even in order to make the claim, as you would say, that there is such a thing as a good king or such a thing as a bad king, we have to assume objective morality. So the ultimate point here, I think where we're going to end up, we start talking about deriving it from a higher authority, is that there are, in fact, values that supersede. In order to even make the claim that one government is better than another, we have to assume, by necessity, we've already been assuming by necessity, that there is such a thing as an objective higher morality that supersedes all of this, and that's a good thing. Well, that allows us to make the claim that there's such a thing as a good king or a bad king.
In my mind, we were not necessarily asking the question, which is the more desirable form of government, or where is the more desirable form of lawmaking authority.
We were talking about where we're deriving the idea of value itself, correct?
Correct. Which, if we're deriving, so if we were to derive the idea of value from the will of the collective, then it would not matter what the collective willed at a given time, so long as the government was in line with what the collective willed. You could not objectively have a good or a bad to what the collective wills.
You can't even make the claim. You can't even really make the claim then that one of these forms of government is better or worse than the other, right? Because they're both completely self-contained. Right.
There would be no objective value by which to gauge anything. It would be
it doesn't matter
completely subjective morality based on the whim of the king or the people.
Yeah, and it doesn't matter which one you pick. There's no way to distinguish between those.
Well, you're correct. You would have to pick one and then go with and then weigh. You're right.
And even the picking between the two is completely subjective.
You're right. Yeah.
So in order to even have this conversation, we have to, by necessity, assume that there is such a thing as a higher morality.
I agree.
Which I think gives us our answer, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, that the interesting thing about that is that it not only necessitates that morality be something, higher morality must be defined outside of a human perception of it. You know, we could sit here and say that higher morality exists and objective morality exists, but I think what most people mean when they say that objective morality exists, I think even regardless of whether they believe they are religious or not, and believe that they're and believe that, you know, where I think this conversation is going, that higher morality is it can only be determined by God, or as I said before, something like God. I think what most people how most people practically think of objective morality is in terms of, well, what I believe to be moral, that if everyone was just smart and thought correctly, they would also believe that that was moral. Mm-hmm. That is what most people think of when they think of objective morality. Mm-hmm. They think of them as having the source outside of themselves, but they think of it as also being identified with their sense of, they think they know what it is. They might think it's outside of themselves, but they think they know what it is. Mm-hmm. And therefore everyone else is compelled to fall in line with that. So I guess that would be an important distinction I think we should make there, is that might be why some people argue for democracy, is because they argue that this set of moral beliefs is outside of themselves, but that they know what the set of moral beliefs is, and if people would just be rational about it, that they could come to adhere to those set of moral beliefs. But even then, those moral beliefs have to be resourced somewhere.
And that, of course, assumes that rationality can... You have to assume that moral beliefs are rational. That just through sake of pure human rationality, you can reason your way to morality. Which to me seems like a really baseless assumption.
Well, your assumption is that human rationality and the ability to ration is the highest moral good.
Yeah, but
because all other moral definitions can be derived from that. Mm-hmm. You'd have to assume that.
Well, can we agree that a government is better than if it recognizes a morality higher than itself that it must itself submit to?
Yes, I would agree with that.
Yes, I don't see any reason to disagree with that.
It seems that flows logically from a recognition of a higher moral value system. So we were talking about what the function of government is and what government should do, and I think if we can agree there's an objective moral value system, that the ideal government would submit to that moral system.
So it seems Sorry, go ahead.
Well, what would it mean to submit to that moral system?
And that's where we get into a lot.
Because to submit to something fundamentally means, again, going back to this idea that we all think we know what's the correct objective morality.
Okay.
But to submit to an objective morality, to submit to something external to yourself, is to submit to it even when you don't want to obey it.
And that is where I think a nation like the United States comes into play, because the United States has created basically the three parts of government so that there's a balance, there's checks and balances, so that
ideally, yes.
Ideally.
Has that worked?
That's a whole other discussion, but
it is a question, right? If the claim is that the United States has created a uniquely powerful system of government that is meant to enforce the idea.
Is that your claim? Is that your claim?
Finish your
thought.
Is that
not uniquely powerful, but the idea behind it is to, instead of just having a government that claims to submit to a higher moral authority, or just throws out these vague notions of being moral, there is actual accountability in a good system.
Well, that was certainly the intent, right? The intent was that the creation of this system would be a barrier against that. My question is, did that actually happen? In other words, did the system that the United States create, in all of its convolutedness, in all of the as it was intended to do exactly what you just said, and I agree that it was intended to do that. Was that actually effective? Was that more effective than the other forms?
Does that matter? because even if it was effective,
yes, it does, because that's the point of the conversation is to determine the role of government, right?
If it was effective at it, all it would be effective at was keeping the government from contradicting itself. Okay, it wouldn't be effective at anything else, because fundamentally, if the branches of government are supposed to keep each other in check, which I think is the idea, they're supposed to keep each other in check from doing things that contradict what has already been established in another branch of government.
Yes.
The Supreme Court's job is not to uphold objective morality. The Supreme Court's job is to uphold the law of the United States.
Yeah. Which
is created by the government of the United States. So the government still ultimately defines its own morality.
But the government, the original founders of the United States made explicitly moral claims when creating the Constitution and setting up the foundation.
Right.
And if you could establish that Josh, we can't hear you. You muted yourself. There you go. You were ranting. What were you saying?
Well, I said the idea was to establish natural rights.
Right.
By
the fundamental claim of the founders, right, was that there was such a thing as a higher morality that was supposed to govern governments.
Well,
and the construction of the government was to.
And their claim further was that the Constitution was not a creation of man, but that it was an attempt to write out a law that existed above man.
These were natural rights, right?
Yes.
These were God-given rights. These were something that went higher than any man, any government could do or say, right? That was the intent. Now, I think the fundamental question is here, did the system that the founders created succeed in upholding those fundamental rights laid out in the Constitution? And did it even lay them out right in the first place? That would be that might be a good question. I think leaving aside, and then maybe we can tackle that question secondly. I think at the very least, if you subscribe to the idea that the rights that are laid out in our founding documents are actually correct ones that actually do stem from a power higher than man, to me, there's no doubt that the systems that they put in place to protect those rights failed miserably. There is no question that we are not the same country. We do not subscribe to those same rights in basically any system today.
In the actions of the government, at the very least, some of the people might still hold to those values.
But
the government certainly
the government does not. And that's been made very, very clear in what's happened in recent history. So the idea that the form of government that they created in order to uphold their fundamental rights did not succeed. Now, regardless of what those rights were, by the way, you could substitute those rights with any. If the question is here, what is the best form of government for upholding natural rights that supersede government, there's no question that the form of government that was created by the founders was not successful in that. Didn't matter if the rights were the right ones or not. We could have substituted those rights in with anything, and it wouldn't have worked.
Perhaps in comparison to all preceding governments and nations, it was
But that's
successful.
another question. Who? That's a good point, right? Because who has been successful in that? What form of government has been successful in upholding that? Is there one?
Well, then we would have to assume that the ideal government is one that exists, which...
We wouldn't necessarily have to assume that yes, that is what we're asking.
Part of the question is here, let's imagine we're trying to found the perfect government, right? Yeah. We're trying to base it off of what we've already seen. The answer is that I haven't seen one.
And we're not trying to found the ideal government, because I don't think anyone would think that's possible. I think we're trying to found the preferred government.
Well, that's a good.
And that's why we're looking at what's already existed, because at this point we can try and do something new, which is what the founders were trying to do.
Okay,
and they were trying to create the preferred government.
Well, so
go ahead.
You're saying we're trying to come up with an idea of what the preferred government would be. But I'm not so sure we have a good reason for not pursuing the ideal government.
I'm not saying we shouldn't pursue the ideal. I'm just saying that when it comes to comparing, I'm not saying that we shouldn't pursue the ideal. It's fine to pursue the ideal.
Well, what kind of problems do you think you could run into?
The perfect government is a perfect king that never dies. That's
Yes.
the perfect government.
Right. So that's
Yes,
I
and-
think
and-
part of the problem with pursuing an ideal government is you hold yourself to unrealistic expectations.
There's a reason it's called an ideal, Josh. Okay, an ideal is not something that can be realized.
Well, but let's assume that we've already. I mean, that is the perfect government, right? It's the king that never dies.
Right.
What's realistic? Is the system placed by, say, the United States founders, that form of government,
Well,
was that more successful in upholding their founding ideals than, say, a empire, a monarchy that has existed for? We've been around we were around in 1776, right? We've not been around for that long, and yet our nation has completely changed since its founding, and of course, if only a few hundred years. Take an empire like Rome, given by it was yes, there were periods where it was a democracy, but those were brief. For the most part, you're talking emperors, right? And yet, for literally thousands of years, I mean, they controlled something like, what was it, like a quarter of the world's population lived under their rule. Like, it was insane, and they were able to uphold their ideals, regardless of whether they were correct ideals or not. The form of government that they had was capable of upholding their ideals for thousands and thousands of years, and the empire lasted, and it existed for that long. My question would be, has our form of government, with its democracy, its representative republic, and all of the convoluted stuff that the founders put in order to preserve its founding ideals, has that form of government been more successful in preserving its founding ideals than, say, a tyranny, an empire has?
There's an interesting piece that comes in here because you have to. One of the thing is that you cannot necessarily separate the form of government from its ideals. So asking whether Rome did a better job of upholding its own ideals than the United States. I mean, you could say that Rome did a better job of upholding its own ideals. You could say that. But you could not say that a system of government like Rome could have done an equal job of upholding the set of ideals that were built into the United States.
In other words, maybe our ideals themselves were were part of the result of our failure to uphold them to some extent. And maybe that's
it certainly may be possible.
That may be a
the
legitimate
Roman
claim.
Ideals
That's
are
a really
the
good
type of
question.
ideals that will not easily fail you unless you start to give them up, which is exactly what happened to the Roman Empire.
That's a very good.
And
that's a very
their
good
system was built around preserving those ideals.
Mm-hmm.
So they had a moral system in place, and it was a moral system that was very self-sustaining. The problem with a moral system that champions rights, the Roman system on some level championed power. The United States system champions rights. At least it claims to. The problem with championing rights is, well, I have a right to disagree with that. And that might not necessarily be in line with promoting the continuation of my rights.
Mm-hmm.
We have been so all over the place with this discussion.
Yeah, we have been.
well,
There's always the threat of a conversation like this. It's just too.
Yeah.
It's too broad.
It's very broad. What were you going to say, Josh?
Does that kind of present the threat of a government with power but without strength?
What's the difference between power and strength?
Power is the ability to coerce action, and strength is the ability to be resilient and.
I feel like strength is. I feel like you could define strength in a lot of different ways.
Yes, you could. I'm trying to make a distinction because.
So,
It's hard.
you
You could define strength as power, or you could define.
You
strength
could.
as something
Yeah,
else.
you could. I'm trying to.
could define strength as might. You could define strength as integrity, and I don't mean that in a moral sense. I mean that in like a physical sense. Like you're physically intact, you're hard to move.
Just, I guess what I'm getting at is you were talking about the system of government for the United States, and its emphasis on rights. And perhaps when the government, instead of focusing upon its own strength and its own abilities, instead focuses on preserving the strength and abilities of its people, preserving their rights, their liberties, then that leads to a government that's kind of shallow. It has some power, but it doesn't have a lot of, I don't know, a lot of. I'm really just toying with this idea, and I don't know how to put it.
Shallow's sort of it's not very. It's very easily moved. It's very easily pushed around.
Yeah. And it would only make sense out of that you would see corruption and corrosion and lots of conflict.
I think we're going to have to, at some point here, draw this to a close. We've already been going for almost an hour and a half. And this is a conversation that should be continued, but
yes.
But I'm worried that we could go for this for another 2 hours.
Oh yeah, we could keep going and going, and maybe it will do us well. We talked about a lot of different things today. Maybe before we come back next time, we can kind of maybe try and come up with a sort of a subtopic here that it's a bit more contained, and we can talk about it without jumping all over the place.
I agree, because this has been
come to
too
conclusions.
big of a topic for
and I don't think it's been too big. I think it's been broad, but I think what we could do next time is have a completely different topic and maybe another broad one. And once we start getting these broad topics out of the way, it'll be easier to kind of narrow them in a bit. Because like when I'm going over the videos, like watching them before publishing them, I'm going to like draw out some key things we discussed in them. And I think we can kind of narrow it down to like 3 or 4.
But is it this is truly. You might end up cutting this part out. I don't know.
Why don't we wrap up the podcast and then continue this conversation after we've stopped?
Yep. So good talk, guys. And we'll just call that the end of the podcast. You've been listening to another Philosophical Tuesday, a production of the Intellectual Stooges. Thank you for listening, and we hope you'll join us again next Tuesday for another episode.